In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Strange Bedfellows. I'm your host, Lori Spencer. Rick Walker is taking this Saturday night off, so I am flying solo with a very special guest coming to us all the way from Durham, England. We are very pleased to welcome to the show author and historian Mel Ayton, author of several books. Mel, how many books have you written?
Because one or two have been like updates, about 10, 12.
I was going to say about 10, but I wanted to be really sure.
Yeah, I hate this question because then you've got to look back and say, well, no, that was just a rehash or an update of like the previous.
Well, you've probably lost count yourself of how many books you've written. It's a lot.
Well, actually, it isn't that many, Laurie. It's about 10.
Wow.
Mostly, not all of them. A lot of them about the assassinations of the 1960s, and one about a racist serial killer. Which, my journey through that book was pretty fascinating. I was invited to his execution. And,
oh, my gosh.
But that's another story. We aren't talking about that. The other one was the upset of the Bermudian government. Bermuda is a territory. They used to call them colonies before. But,
right.
They voted to stay in as a territory of the United Kingdom. And I had two whistleblowers from Scotland Yard for that one. I wrote an article about the assassination of the governor and the police chief and the riots in Bermuda. And the two detectives in Scotland Yard were that incensed that they had this secret file, which told the real story. And that there was a third man involved. Two men were executed for the crime. I don't want to get into it too much, but I had sort of direct contact with the players at the time it happened, which was a long, long time ago. I lived in Bermuda. So these two Scotland Yard detectives, they invited me down to Scotland Yard on their boss's lunch break.
Mm-hmm.
Gave me a pass, met me at the entrance, gave me a pass, took me into a room. I photocopied, or they actually photocopied. I was speed reading in this room, this file about that thing. And so speed reading, handing them to the two detectives there. And so I eventually left, and I thanked them profusely, of course, because it was such a great thing that they did. But they were upset that the truth wasn't out about the governor's assassination, Sir Richard Chavez. So I left with the file, met a friend in Whitehall opposite 10 Downing Street. I went into a pub with this friend and dropped the file on the floor, and the papers were all over. Well, that's where the MPs drank. So it's just a story in itself, really.
Wow.
So anyway, eventually the assembly in Bermuda, it was mentioned in dispatches, so to speak, and quite a few people were upset because one of the gang's leaders ended up in charge of the police and prison department.
How convenient.
Which is quite shocking.
Wow.
That was many years later, decades later. So, I eventually named the third man involved who escaped. He escaped the island dressed as a woman. And so that book is still selling in Bermuda because, it's really one of the most horrific crimes that was never fully investigated.
That's
So when
incredible.
people accuse me of saying I'm an apologist for, the 60s assassinations and the, mouthpiece of the CIA, someone wrote, uh, clearly, I've proven that, if I find the truth, I'll write about it.
Well, that's why I wanted to talk to you. I've been, as you know, producing a series about the 55th anniversary of the trial of Sirhan Sirhan. And it surprises me that there really is not a proper biography of the killer of Sirhan Sirhan. And the title of this show tonight, as part of my ongoing series, Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, tonight's title is The Motive. I think that through the years, researchers, and even at the time of his trial, there was a tendency among the press to dismiss what he did as the act of a madman. And nobody really bothered to look into his motive at the time. And now, I think, in light of the situation in Gaza, the Israel Palestine conflict, now is the perfect time to talk about his motive, because the motive was anti Zionism. And that's the part of the case that is much misunderstood. And I think of all the researchers who have tackled this case, you seem to be the only one who really latched on to his motive, and you've done a deep dive on how he grew up, why he believed what he did, how he became radicalized, and why he targeted Senator Kennedy specifically. Because when you go through Sirhan's notebooks, it's fascinating that even a year, more than a year before the assassination, during the Six-Day War, the Arab-Israeli conflict, at that time, he was already planning in his mind, premeditating certain politicians that he wanted to kill, just because they were pro-Israel. He had targeted President Lyndon Johnson, Vice President Humphrey, UN Ambassador Goldberg, and then eventually set his sights on Robert Kennedy. So I wanted to start there and ask you a little bit about, you had told me before in 1968, you have a firsthand memory of the assassination. I wanted to ask you what you thought of it then, and has that changed through the years? Have you changed your mind? And if you did, what changed your mind?
The only thing that's changed really is the the image of the American public had. They were totally confused because they heard that he was a Jordanian citizen, and oh my goodness me, Americans thought really Jordan was the most liberal of the Arab states, which was at war with Israel. And King Hussein was a good friend of the United States, and so they couldn't understand it. Did it for my country? What is that? Jordan? Did it for? So they didn't understand the Palestinian issue. Didn't understand the West Bank and how after the Six-Day War, the Israelis took over the West Bank, which was previously part of Jordan. So they just couldn't understand it.
Right. And this was also, I should point out, before the age of terrorism. In 1968, this was before the age of hijackings, which became very commonplace in the 70s and 80s up until 9/11. Before 9/11, in 1968, I think most Americans were focused on the war in Vietnam, not so much on the Middle East. The Six-Day War was over in 6 days. Most people just forgot about it. The American college campuses were, protesting the war in Vietnam, not so much the war in the Middle East. We didn't understand at all the first thing about this conflict, and the what they call the occupation of the West Bank was less than a year old, as you pointed out. That was newly acquired territory. And the PLO, I wouldn't even become active for another year until 1969. So I don't even. Do you think that even the prosecutors involved understood Sirhan's motives at the time?
I don't think so, because they never highlighted it that much during the trial. Um, they wanted like a simple approach. The defense did too, actually. The defense wanted diminished capacity defense. In other words, Sirhan was crazy, therefore that's why he killed Kennedy, and the jury should look on Sirhan with some kind of sympathy because he was suffering from diminished capacity. The prosecution just simply wanted the years and find him guilty. So really, uh, both the defense and the prosecution simply didn't look into it too deeply about the real motive of Sirhan. But I go on to say that nothing is simple. All of these things are very complex. It wasn't just the motive of hatred for Israel, hatred for Jews, actually. It was deep down anti-Semitism, which he acquired from his parents, actually. And the whole family were like that, which a lot of people don't understand. A lot of people don't understand that Mary Sirhan, really, her hatred for Jews was such that, there were certain comments that I report in the book, which I wouldn't like to repeat, on this program about Jews.
And
Absolutely.
Mary, just to clarify, that's his mother, right? Mary Sirhan was his mother.
So, his anti-Semitism was just incredibly strong, fanatical.
And baked in. Let's talk a little bit about his childhood. He was born in Jerusalem in what, 1947, I believe? No, 44.
44.
Yeah,
March
44.
44, yeah.
So he was a very young child when the War
Well,
of
he was 4 years old
1948.
during the 48 War of Independence, yeah.
Yes, tell me about that a little bit. What was his childhood like?
Well, he was, the family had a house. Originally, the family was from Taiba, which is just outside Ramallah. Um, the the father moved the family to Mizrara district, which is just a stone's throw from the Damascus Gate. I've been to these sites and I've been to Ramallah too, and it's just fascinating to see, the culture, the atmosphere in these places. But during the war, the family fled inside the old city to a place inside the old city because of the fighting. And there were about 9 families in one building, and it was a poor upbringing. So the Jewish communities too within the walled city, they had to flee, and everybody who's on the supporting Palestinians are always talking about how the Nakba and how the Palestinians were forced to flee. Well, not all of them were forced to flee. In fact, Ben Gurion, wanted Arabs to stay. But
That's right.
the circumstances of war are totally different from normal circumstances, and these things happen. But they always go on about the Nakba and how they have to flee from their homes. But no one ever talks about what happened in Iraq, forced to flee. What happened in Syria, forced to flee. What happened in Lebanon, forced to flee. They all go on about the Palestinian diaspora, but they never talk about Morocco, even as far west as Morocco in the Arab states. And then Libya, Egypt, they're all forced to flee, the Jewish communities, the Jewish families. Why that's never mentioned, it's just beyond me. But this is what happens in war. But as far as the Palestinians were concerned, there were 750,000. There were about the same number of Jewish families forced to flee as the Palestinians. They were either
right.
forced to flee or because of fighting, they voluntarily fled. They always go on about the massacres as well. Dear Yasin, the favourite one mentioned. They never mention the massacres committed by the uh, Arabs in various places in Palestine, and there were quite a few. So this balance just doesn't exist with the pro-Palestinian authors, really.
And Sirhan grew up, his earliest memories were violence, of war. And he grew up, as I understand, in a pretty violent household. His father, same name, I guess, Bashara, Sirhan's middle name, but his father was apparently a very violent man who used to beat his sons unconscious, I'm told. Is that true?
Well, I didn't come across any unconscious. I wouldn't use those words. But no, he didn't especially pick on Sirhan as opposed to the other sons. The two oldest sons, Saidella and Sharif, were older, a lot older than Sirhan, Munir, and Adele, the five brothers. And Bishara, the father, Bishara, originally, he's a well-respected worker in Palestine, working for the British mandatory government, and he made decent money for Arabs at the time, and but he was a violent man, and he did treat his family with disdain. He followed. It's all part of the culture, He was the man. He was the boss, and his family had to do everything that he told them. This led to a split between the two oldest sons in Jerusalem, and the two oldest boys were borrowing money in their father's name, and of course this led to great conflict. But the father was like that. There was only one daughter, Ada. But, she died young.
Yeah.
So really, there's very little information about Ada apart from details of her marriage. The family didn't like the idea she was marrying someone who was not part of the culture. So. Yes, he was very violent towards his family and his wife. He didn't let when they moved to America. They moved to America when Sirhan was 12 in 1956. When they moved there, Bishara hated it. Of course, Mary Sirhan, the mother, liked it because she had more freedoms.
Right.
And Bishara hated it. He didn't last long there, perhaps a year or so. And then he moved to New York. He didn't leave the country immediately. He moved to New York to work. And, the two oldest sons never really stayed with the family from the beginning. They didn't come over till 1960, 4 years later. And when they came over, there was no meeting of minds between the father and his two oldest sons. And they just really hated each other. And the two oldest boys as well, of course, they had contact with the mother in Pasadena, Mary, but they didn't really have anything to do with Sirhan and the other brothers, Adele and Munir. They had little sort of contact with them. So yes, you're right. He was very, but he wasn't especially vicious to Sirhan as opposed to the other sons.
Right. And I think that some of his other brothers also had criminal records as juvenile delinquents, and I think one was threatened to kill his girlfriend. was
Right.
stalking her. And
Well, actually, he
tell
was
me
found
about
guilty.
that.
Yeah, that was Sharif. And
Sharif.
Sharif, he was the second. Sedella was I wasn't sure. Sorry, I might be getting mixed up here. But anyway, Sharif, yes, he not only threatened to kill his girlfriend, he cut the brake pipes on his girlfriend's car, and he was found guilty. Yeah, and so he was kind of treated leniently by the courts. Um, Munir was arrested. He ran away from home, was arrested for selling marijuana. Uh, the Sirhan didn't have any criminal background. He wasn't getting into trouble. Adele was probably the most pleasant of all the brothers. Everyone speaks highly of him, all the people who knew him. My recent book, a lot of it is looking at the family and looking at, testimony, statements made by friends and family. And Adele comes out of the story, looking pretty good. He's a musician at a club, Lou Shelby's club in Pasadena, called the Fez, and we seem to be liked by most people. Sirhan was not the gentle guy he was portrayed. When he was in high school, he made a few friends, but he's obviously they describe him in a different way from what you see in conspiracy groups. They describe him as gentle, no interest in politics, and we'll have to get onto that subject, Laurie, because this idea, all of the conspiracy groups talk about, he had little interest in politics. Well, I can tell you that was interest in something, and it was just not like that at all. So, Sirhan then, as a jockey, he was very cruel to the horses. Most of the people, when he was hired, most of the people who were in charge, his foreman and the owner of the stables and the like, all of the other trainee jockeys and stable boys and people like that. Yes, there are many stories about where, he would lose his temper with the horses and actually punch the horses in the mouth.
Wow.
You never hear this in conspiracy books. He had a violent temper. And then, we can link a lot of this life story with the actual events of the assassination. One in particular is everybody says, oh my goodness me, Sirhan was hypnotized. When you're hypnotized, you get the strength of Samson and all of that kind of silly statements. Well, his school friends used to say how wiry and strong Sirhan was. He was pretty good.
He was a little guy, but he was very
little
strong.
guy, 5'2", but he was strong and wiry.
Yeah.
And he could handle himself very well. And he had a lot of strength. So connect that with the statements, and you see where these statements are coming from. They're coming from fantasy. But he did have a temper. He was strong. But the most interesting part of the whole story of Sirhan, of course, and his background, is the overwhelming evidence that he was an incredible. He's growing in fanaticism. You mentioned before about the 67 onwards, his behavior. Look, long before he went to Pasadena College, he was thinking about assassination. He underlined passages in which eventually found those library books, and he became fascinated with assassinating someone. And I think
that's right. He was fascinated by the assassination of the King of Jordan
in
in 1951.
You're right, Laurie. as far back as that, just fascinated with what he was like a young boy living in Jerusalem. And
As a boy,
he was assassinated. The Dome of the Rock, that place there. So it was a big story.
That's right.
I think it was around about 51 or 52.
It was 51, and 51. It was kind of similar to how he took out Robert Kennedy. It was an assassin lying in wait for the king with a handgun and walked right up and shot him dead outside the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
That's right. So, he had this fascination long before people sort of guessed. You readers, your listeners, your viewers will not hear and not hear or read an awful lot of things that are in Sirhan in these files. I mean, clearly, you probably realize that I've gone through literally hundreds, thousands of pages of files, and it's not just the Special Unit Senate LAPD files. It's the FBI files. It's the wealth of material where John Widener, interviews with John Widener, that was just so fascinating. Why? Because he was Sirhan's last boss. The last job he had was to work in a health store in Pasadena, and his boss was John Widener, a hero of the Second World War because he rescued Jews and was recognized as such by Israel. A very, very committed Christian, and so he just knew Sirhan inside out. And that's what leads me on to say that it wasn't just the temper and the violence. Well, certainly the violence against horses, but it was his fanaticism. It shines through in statement after statement made by the people who knew him, even his relatives, even his family. I've got on record so many statements describing Sirhan's behavior vis-a-vis the Six-Day War, how Jews were running America, how he was upset about that purported nonsense, how they controlled his life, everything that happened to him. When he didn't get a job, he went to the Employment Bureau and he didn't get a job. The Jews. All of this, it's just so much. And that's why I wrote the sequel to The Forgotten Terrorist, because there was so much information that people weren't putting out there about, his life and how you need to understand a person's life to understand the crimes they commit.
Precisely. And that's why this book is so important, why The Forgotten Terrorist was so important. And in your 2019 edition, Alan Dershowitz wrote the foreword, which I thought was a great foreword. I think Dershowitz really grasps Sirhan's motives and understands why he did it.
Very, very clear. But I must add that in a person's life, we all have complex personalities. There is nothing is simple. There are complexities, and the complexity with Sirhan is that it wasn't just the political motive; he had a personal motive, and that personal motive was he was a nobody who wanted to be a somebody. So that was quite clear.
That really came across to me when I was reading the LAPD interviews with Walter Crowe, who was, I guess you'd call him Sirhan's best friend or Sirhan's only friend.
Lori.
He was a communist, a member of the Communist Party, and he was trying to get Sirhan to join the party at their last meeting 2 months before the assassination of Kennedy. They went out for a couple of beers, and his friend is trying to talk him into joining the Communist Party. And Sirhan said, "No, I want to be a millionaire." I don't want to be a communist. I want to be a millionaire. Shocked his friend.
This is part of the story of the second part of his motive, which was the first. He was a failure. I mean, he flunked out of Pasadena College. He just didn't have it. But he thought he did. It was narcissistic in his behavior. He thought he really did. He thought he was more intellectual, more intelligent than the people he dealt with. And this is all part and parcel of the story. That his self-image, just didn't live up to, and his expectations just didn't live up to, which is why he hated American society. It was American society that made him a failure in life, a loser. And because he was a loser, he wanted to build up a self-image. And he could do that through being a committed Palestinian warrior. He could get his self-image, his self-esteem through that, because he couldn't get it through employment. He was a failure at everything he did. So that's the complexity of it, not just the political motive, but the personal motive as well. It's all mixed in.
Since we were talking about his father, and I do find his father to be a pretty fascinating character, I want to play you a clip here. I don't know if you've ever seen this. Reporter for CBS, a guy named Terrence Smith. He's the guy who, after the assassination, he was on assignment in Israel, and it was his job to go tell Sirhan's father what his son had done. He didn't know, and he found out from Terrence Smith. This is a clip of Terrence Smith explaining what that was like. Pretty interesting. Take a look.
It wasn't so long ago that Terrence Smith was a correspondent here at Sunday Morning. He's out with a new memoir, 4 Wars, 5 Presidents, which includes a story about an encounter with the father of convicted assassin Sirhan Sirhan, whose recent bid for parole was denied by California Governor Gavin Newsom.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there. Thank you very much.
When Robert Kennedy was shot in Los Angeles on June 5th, 1968,
Would a doctor come right here?
I was thousands of miles away in Jerusalem, Israel, as a correspondent for the New York Times. I quickly learned that the shooter's father, Sirhan Sirhan Sr., lived in a small village in the West Bank. It was 10 p.m. and dark by the time I arrived at the Sirhan house. I rapped on the door, and a small man in his pajamas answered. I explained that I was a reporter, and typical of Palestinian hospitality, Sirhan Sirhan Sr. invited me in and insisted on making coffee. I asked him if he had heard that Kennedy had been shot. Yes, he said, and thought it was terrible news. I asked him if he had heard that the assassin had been caught on the spot. Yes, he said. I asked one more question. Had he heard the name of the captured assassin? No, he said. He'd gone to bed and had not heard it. Just stunned, I pushed my reporter's notebook across the kitchen table and asked him to write the names of his 5 sons. The 4th name in the list, Sirhan Sirhan Jr. I put my finger on that name and looked him in the eye and said, "That's the assassin." Sirhan was shocked, first incredulous, then angry. Sirhan Sirhan Jr. had been the best of his boys, he said. Then his face darkened, and he said, if he did it, he should hang. With more reporting, I learned the Sirhan family had been deeply troubled. The father had lost his job and blamed the Israelis. He beat his wife and sons, and the mother escaped by moving with the boys to California. Sirhan Sirhan Jr. grew up hating the Israelis and hating anyone who supported Israel. Anyone, that is, like Robert Kennedy. Should the 77-year-old assassin be granted parole after 5 decades in prison? As someone who admired Robert Kennedy, I can't claim to be objective. But I would say no. Not now, not in 18 months at the next parole hearing. I'd say the governor got it right.
That interview's a few years old. Sirhan, of course, is now 80 years old, just turned 80 in March. Before we move to the next clip, I actually have another clip I want to play you of an interview with Sirhan's father. This is in the sentencing phase of his trial after Sirhan had been convicted, and the jury was deciding whether or not to send him to the gas chamber to give him the death penalty. And I ran across this clip, and I think you'll find it interesting if you haven't seen it before. His father is asked about the Palestinian liberation cause. And his father, of course, as you know, was a pretty political man himself. He issues a warning, a stark warning in this interview, basically saying that if you send my son to the gas chamber, there's going to be big trouble on the horizon for the United States in the future.
Mr. Sirhan,
Yes.
do you think there will be an appeal?
Well, I think there is going to be an appeal, and there is going to be more than this. More than this. And I want to say this to the court, and I want to mention the American people too. They shouldn't keep quiet for the action which took against Sirhan in the court, because this action is going to bring more trouble to the Americans, to the leaders of the United States, and this which I don't want. They should think a little further. They should think about the reason which pushed Sirhan to kill Senator Kennedy. And I want to advise the leaders of the United States and the whole leaders in the world to take a real action, to take a real steps for peace. Otherwise, there will be more trouble and more trouble and more trouble. And this is against my will. And if they keep sticking to put Sirhan in the gas chamber or to give him a life in prison, I am sure this will have a reaction all over the world.
That is fascinating. That is Sirhan Sirhan's father. And what he's basically saying there, he's warning about the future, and it's not a distant future. 1 month after Sirhan's conviction, a wave of hijackings begun by Palestinian terrorists who took flights. Most of this was done by PLO-associated groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. And their first hijacking was a series of 5 flights that were hijacked simultaneously on September 11th, 1970. They took hundreds of passengers hostage, and fortunately in that case, the passengers were released unharmed. But in that wave of hijackings, the hijackers' demands were the release of Sirhan Sirhan from prison. At that time, President Nixon said no, he wasn't going to negotiate with terrorists, and they did release the hostages. And the only reason that they did so was that Sirhan's mother, Mary Sirhan, and some of his brothers held a press conference literally begging the hijackers to release those hostages unharmed. They said, please do not kill in Sirhan's name. And that is the reason why the hijackers decided to go ahead and let them go unharmed that time. But then, 2 years later, the same group, the PFLP, hijacked a Lufthansa flight that had the son of Robert Kennedy, Joseph P. Kennedy, his eldest son, on board the aircraft. And they hijacked the flight because they knew the son of Bobby Kennedy was on board. In that case, the flight was diverted to Yemen, and once again they demanded $5 million and the release of Sirhan from prison. And once again, President Nixon said nope. That time they also thankfully released those hostages unharmed. And then a year after that came the Munich Olympics, when they took the Israeli team hostage and murdered them all, and also murdered police officers in a shootout at the airport. A year after that, Palestinian terrorists, the Black September group, burst into the American embassy in Saudi Arabia at Khartoum, took 9 diplomats hostage. I believe 3 of them were Americans, once again demanding the release of Sirhan Sirhan from prison. And once again, President Nixon said, nope, not going to negotiate with terrorists. And that time, they killed all of the hostages. And I think we just lost Mel. Where did he go? While we're waiting for Mel to come back, it looks like he's having some internet issues. I'm going to play you another clip here. This is Carrie Kennedy. She's also the daughter of Robert Kennedy, sister of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. As you well know, when Sirhan was approved by the California Parole Board for parole a couple of years back, there was a split in the Kennedy family. Most of the Kennedy family, including Bobby's widow, Ethel Kennedy, and most of their kids, they wanted to keep Sirhan locked up. They want him to serve out his life in prison. But Robert F. Kennedy Jr. wants him to be released. And one of his brothers, Douglas Kennedy, also advocated for Sirhan's release on grounds of compassion. But Carrie Kennedy was interviewed here by NBC News, and she is very passionate in her belief that Sirhan is guilty as sin and that he should never see the light of day again. Take a look.
Robert Kennedy's daughter, Carrie Kennedy, joins us now. Carrie, thank you very much. I know this has really weighed on your family for 5 months at least while this was being reviewed. So I know you're gratified by the decision. Do you think there still is the possibility, despite the governor's very complete statement, a lengthy statement about all of the evidence of Sirhan's refusal to acknowledge his guilt, do you think there's a chance he could be released down the road?
First of all, I'm so very, very grateful to Governor Newsom for citing with justice on this issue. He's going to come up for parole every 18 months for the rest of his life. And this is very, very dangerous to society. I remember as a kid, we campaigning with Daddy. We went to Disneyland in California, and then that night of June 5th, we went to the Ambassador Hotel and waited for the returns to come back. And then I was only 8 years old, so I was sent to my hotel, our hotel, which was elsewhere in LA. And I went to sleep. And the next morning I got up to watch cartoons because it was still on East Coast time. And I was watching Bugs Bunny alone in this hotel with my feet crossed. And I'm watching the screen. And that's how I learned that my father had been shot. And then we went back to Virginia. And the next day my brother called me and told me that we had lost my dad. And the first thing I did was I prayed for Daddy. And I prayed for my mother and our family. And then I prayed for his killer. And I said, please, God, don't kill the guy who killed my father. Because I didn't want any other family to go through what we had gone through. And that feeling is still here today. I don't want any other family to go through what we have gone through. And that's why this guy cannot get out of jail. He has no remorse. He has no regret. He has not been rehabilitated. And he has a hair trigger rage. And he's very, very, very dangerous to society. And he can't be let up.
Carrie, I don't think I ever heard that story before. And it's unimaginable. You know, I know where I was a kid reporter, and you know, in the newsroom late that night because of the California time distance. And it, of course, had come only months after Dr. King's death. So 1968 was just a horrendous year for the nation, but for your family, 8 children at the time. There were 8 children left without a father. And your mom...
No, 11. 11.
Excuse me, I meant 11 children. 11 children.
Yeah.
And your mother. And
my mother. And incidentally, he did this. He said it was premeditated. He brought a gun. He did this on the anniversary of the Arab-Israeli war. He went to target practice that morning. He built bullets that specifically were incredibly fatal. He went to the hotel where my father was, and he shot my father twice. And he also shot 5 other people. And he nearly killed my mother, who was right next to my father, who was pregnant with my baby sister. I mean, this wasn't just a random shooting. This was a massacre.
Well, and I know your family was divided over this, and that had to be very painful with Bobby Jr., you know, leading the way.
You know, Andrea, like we just discussed, 11 kids. There are over 150 Kennedys, first cousins, nieces, and nephews, relatives of Joe and Rose Kennedy. There is nothing that we all agree on. So when you come from a group that large, you're just going to expect that not everybody's on the same page all the time. And that's the way it rolls. But really, the point is not about our family. The point is about your family. The point is about our country. This was a political assassination. This was a terrorist attack on our democracy. It was the killing of a United States senator in the middle of a presidential campaign. And our country has never healed from that. The difference between having Bobby Kennedy as president versus Richard Nixon as president, with his Southern strategy of dividing black against white in order to get more and more votes, is still with us today. And that's what led up to Donald Trump. And so my dad spent that entire campaign, his major theme was healing divisions. He said peace, justice, and compassion for those who suffer. That's what the United States should stand for. So yes, I lost my father, and my 10 brothers and sisters lost their father. But our country lost our leader, and that's what this is about.
Kerry Kennedy, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And there's no way to speak. There's no way to even address how unspeakable it was for you and for the nation.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrea.
Well, thanks for being with us.
So Kerry Kennedy was very clear. She just calls him flat out a terrorist. I wanted to get your thoughts on that. While we were disconnected, I was explaining to the audience about how the assassination of Robert Kennedy set a series of events in motion of terror attacks, skyjackings, including the skyjacking of her brother, Joseph Kennedy, the eldest son of Robert Kennedy. He was on a flight that was hijacked in 1972. And also the incident at the embassy in Saudi Arabia in Khartoum, where they killed 9 diplomats, including 3 Americans. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about how Sirhan became a hero in the Palestinian liberation movement and the series of events that followed the assassination.
Sirhan was seen as a Palestinian hero. Really, it's as simple as that. They didn't directly make contact with him, but there were many people in the Arab diplomatic community in the United States who, had access to him and did talk to him. M.T. Mehdi was one particular guy. He wrote a short book the year after the assassination. Really, it was just a rant against Israel. And, yes, he was put up as a hero to the Palestinians. It still is to this day. And when I caught a little bit of what Kerry Kennedy was saying, and it's not just the horror of the act. It's if Sirhan was released, I predict there'll be demonstrations in the West Bank and Gaza. There'll be demonstrations in the United States, and he will be yet once again. He won't be forgotten anymore. He'll be put up as a hero, an example to his people. It really is as simple as that. If he's released. The courts have certain stipulations when somebody's released on parole. Yes, he'll have to abide by certain things. They probably refuse his passport. So can you imagine what would happen if someone, got a passport and went over to Middle East, went over to the West Bank?
I think he'll be deported, won't he? Because he's not an American citizen. So if he is released, they would deport him back to Jordan or Palestine, correct?
That's possible. There's also the fact that, he could stay in California. But if he is, if that's the decision they make when he's eventually released, if he's released, then there'd have to be government negotiations. The American government, the Jordanian government. It's doubtful whether the Israelis would allow him to actually go back to his home place in the West Bank. Across the Jordan River, Amman, perhaps. We don't know. But there's, I'd like to get on to, there's something very important which I'd like to say about the conspiracy idea that Thane Eugene Caesar, the security guard who was standing next to Kennedy, was responsible for Robert Kennedy's death.
Yes, as a matter of fact, before you do, let me play a clip from Kerry's brother, 2024 independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who talks about Thane Caesar here. And I thought you might be interested to hear what Bobby has to say. You've probably heard his spiel before, but you can take some notes while he talks, and we will tell me where he gets it wrong. Let's take a look at this.
But I always assumed Sirhan killed my father. He confessed to the crime. He had, he said he didn't remember anything, but he pled guilty, and he didn't have a trial. He had a kind of a sentencing hearing because he pled guilty. So I always assumed it. And then a man named Paul Schrade, who'd been a very close friend of my father's and political associate, he was one of the top deputies of the United Auto Workers. And he had introduced my father to Cesar Chavez and recruited Cesar Chavez to the labor movement. So he was very close. Cesar Chavez became, one of my father's most important political allies. Schrade was standing next to my father when the shooting started, and he took the first bullet to his head. And he was okay in the long run, but he was shot in the head. Sirhan fired 2 shots at my father. The first one hit Paul Schrade. The second, and Paul Schrade, incidentally, I tell you the punchline, called me and said, I don't know, 10 years ago, and said, I want you to come to my house and read the autopsy report on your dad. You can imagine the last thing in the world that I ever wanted to do. But I couldn't say no to him because he had taken a bullet for my father. And he was a good friend, so I went and talked to him. And he showed me the autopsy report and then, a lot of other information. But essentially, after reading that, it was impossible for me to believe that Sirhan had...
Hey, I'm Christy. I run a system setup company, and I'm also a digital nomad. One of my favorite tools for managing my...
Kill my dad, and I'll tell you why. Sirhan fired 2 shots at my father. The first one hit my father, put Paul Schrade in the head. The second one hit a door jamb, a wooden door jamb behind my father, and was later removed from that door jamb by the LAPD. At that point, he was grabbed. It was a crowded room. There's 77 people in the room, in the kitchen. And he was standing in front of a steam table. My father was 5 feet in front of him. My father never turned his back. All kinds of eyewitnesses. He was grabbed by 6 men, including Rayford Johnson, who I've talked to about it, Rosie Greer, who was part of the fearsome foursome, the Oakland Raiders, and 4 other guys, men, and they piled on top of him. Rayford Johnson said to me, Sirhan is a little tiny guy, and almost feeble looking. I mean, today he's feeble looking. And I spent about 3 hours with him in jail, sitting in the prison with him. These men took his hand, the first thing they did, and pointed away from my father. But Rayford Johnson said, toward the other end of the room, Rayford Johnson said to me, Rayford Johnson was the decathlon champion in 1960, a huge guy, super strong, and he said, this little man had superhuman strength, and I could not get the gun away from him. And he emptied the revolver. It was a revolver. He emptied it. He had 8 shots in it, and he never reloaded. And he shot 6 times in the other direction. All 6 of those bullets hit people. 5 of them, one of them went through one guy's clothing, and another, it also wounded his leg. He hit people in the stomach, we know what happened to every one of those bullets, right? That's 8 bullets. We know what happened to every one of them. My father, the autopsy report shows, was shot 4 times from behind. And they were contact shots. One of them did not hurt him, but went through the shoulder pad of his jacket. The other ones all hit him. And the last one, which was the most fatal, was right behind his ear, an inch from his ear, but with the barrel touching his skin. And the other ones were all contact shots, meaning that they were within probably a half an inch of his skin and clothing, and they left carbon tattoos on his skin. And Sirhan was never behind my father. And there was many, many eyewitnesses. The guy who almost certainly fired those shots, was a man called Eugene Thane Cesar. And Eugene Thane Cesar died a year and a half ago in the Philippines. I was in conversations trying to see him, and he said he would talk to me. And I had to pay him $10,000. And then when I was about to leave, he said, now I want $20,000. And then he said, I want $25,000. And I realized he's, playing me, so I didn't go. He was a security guard who had gotten the job the day before, when people already knew where my father was going. His real job was he originally worked for Hughes Tool, which is a military contractor owned by Howard Hughes, and run by a lot of guys from Las Vegas. And then he went to Boeing and Lockheed, and he had top secret clearance. And he described himself, Lisa Pease, who's an author, found documents where he describes himself as a CIA agent. And he was very public about his hatred for my father, that he thought my father was going to turn the country over to black people. And he then lied continuously to the police. By the way, my father, when he fell onto Cesar, and Cesar escorted him. He wasn't supposed to go into the kitchen. He grabbed him by his elbow and escorted him into the ambush. Sirhan's ambush. And presumably, while Sirhan was shooting and everybody could see this man firing, he was quietly, the bullets hit my father. The gun was laying against some skin, and all of them were on an upward trajectory. This is what the autopsy report shows. And my father must have known that he was being shot by Sirhan because he turned and pulled off, as he was falling, he pulled off Cesar's clip-on tie. And if you see the pictures of my father lying on the ground, some of them, the early ones have a clip-on tie. Then my mother took that out and put a rosary in my dad's hand. Oh, but the original ones have that clip-on tie. And Cesar, there's a picture of Cesar with no tie on. And and so, you know, he was, and by the way, 12 people saw him when he got up. He pushed my father's off of him and stood up, and he had his gun drawn. And when the police came, he said he had pulled his gun to fire at Sirhan. But they never confiscated his gun. And then he lied about the gun later. And, you know,
if there was ever any time in the last 200 years that an independent candidate could win the presidency, it's now. Even the traditional.
The gun has now been recovered. It had a very weird journey. It was stolen. It was thrown into a lake by some teenagers. The lake was drained, and there's a guy now. The gun is now being tested, but it's clear that Sirhan was involved, and there's a long, long backstory to that, to what might have happened that I'm not going to talk about or speculate because it's a long story. But that he did not actually fire the shots that killed my dad. Oh.
Okay, I'm going to leave that there. It takes Bobby a while to tell a story. That was kind of a long clip. He's not much of a soundbite guy, but Mel, I wanted to get your take on that and tell me where Bobby gets it wrong, in your opinion.
He gets it wrong simply because he isn't using logic to understand Eugene Caesar. I don't know where he gets his information, but I know for sure that Thane Eugene Caesar, not one person in the country saw Thane Eugene Caesar with a gun. Not one, let alone shoot Robert Kennedy. One person initially, he's called Don Schulman. He is the guy who told investigators he thought he saw a security guard with a gun in his hand. Yes, he did. He saw Thane Eugene Caesar. When the shooting started, Gene Caesar was knocked to the ground, or he threw himself to the ground when the shooting started. He didn't pull his gun. It was a .38 caliber pistol, checked by his supervisor when he started work that evening. He didn't. Don Schulman eventually, under future investigations a few years later, admitted that he was mistaken. He was wrong. Yet, conspiracists still use the original statement that he made. And remember, only one out of a pantry full of 77 people said they saw a security guard shoot him. Now, Robert Kennedy Jr., it certainly isn't using logic when it comes to Thane Eugene Caesar. Thane Caesar started work that night, around about 6:30. He was given his positions in the hotel by the supervisor for Ace Security, working with the head of the Ambassador Hotel security staff, where they would position the security hotel people and the Ace security hotel people. Those two told Thane Eugene Caesar where to go. At any particular time that night. To say that, remember, if Thane Eugene Caesar was part of a conspiracy, he would have to coordinate with the activities of Sirhan in the pantry. That means, by this twisted logic, that Thane Eugene Caesar was working with another two people, totally innocent people, by the way. I mean, it's ridiculous to even suggest it, to arrive at the pantry at that particular time to coordinate with Sirhan.
And those two men never met, right? We should make it clear that Sirhan and Caesar did not know each other. They never ever met.
There's no evidence at all for that. But the most important part is what I've just sort of mentioned, that now they are dragging another two people into the conspiracy. It would have to be because they told Thane Eugene Caesar where to go at any particular night. He was at a few places that night, all recorded. So that would mean, this is what they keep doing. It's like whack-a-mole. Once you sort of explain one thing, they let that go and then latch onto another. Remember, there are millions of pages, and this is what happens. This is one of the reasons why you get these things going on, is because there's, unless some murder cases, there's too little information. In this case, there's too much. It's too much for people to grab onto. If you've got, and Special Unit Senator was a part of the team in the LAPD, which had responsibility. They got I know the LAPD's been criticized about, in the past history about corruption and things like that. But this was the best and the brightest. Robert Hutton was the head of the team. And they had so many. And then you had so many forensics investigations. You had the FBI involved. So with this many people, some anomalies are going to occur. Some mistakes are going to be made. Human beings aren't perfect. We do not live in a perfect world. Yet conspiracists think apparently we do. So you're going to get mistakes made. And yes, there were some mess-ups by the LAPD. Of course, there were some botched parts of the investigation. But taken as a whole, it came to the right conclusions.
I'm curious. Let me ask you one more thing about Thane Caesar. It seems that you believe that he was a man who was innocent and falsely accused.
And I told him that the year before he died.
Yeah, 50 years, this man, he had to leave the country, just to get some peace and quiet in his life. And an author, a friend of yours, Dan Moldea, managed to track him down. He was living in the Philippines and coaxed him into taking a polygraph test, which I understand he passed. And, he wouldn't speak to journalists. I think Dan Moldea was the only journalist that he would speak to. I don't think you ever got to interview Caesar before he died, did you?
I didn't interview him, but I did speak to him. I was with Dan Moldea at the time, and we were in a restaurant when I visited in 2018. Dan and I met up with our wives, and we had a meal. We got out for a meal, and it was then that Dan just got Gene Caesar on the phone, and he just expressed his, thank you for, doing what you're doing, getting the truth out, because he couldn't win. When the first allegations came out, he did get a lawyer, and his lawyer told him, you're dealing with people with no money. You're not going to, it's a pointless exercise. And sue, because originally Thane Caesar did want to sue. Robert Kennedy makes it you'll have to talk to Dan Moldea about this, because Dan Moldea knows the full story. Now, Robert Kennedy has been economical with the truth when it comes to Thane Eugene Caesar. Robert Kennedy, as you heard, I want 10,000, I want 20,000. wasn't as simple as that at all. And by the way, I got to say this because it's very important for my book, talking about my book and talking about my, the sequel to The Forgotten Terrorist. I would not have been able to write my books without Dan. Dan Muldaur is the man who solved this case. I just built on the shoulders of giants, really, with my work. And I concentrated, of course, on looking at in The Forgotten Terrorist, looking at the conspiracy theories and finding out how ridiculous many of them were. While I have it in mind, because clearly it's such a wide subject, there's so many things, but I want to get that over about Dan Muldaur. Dan Muldaur is the hero of this case, okay? And yeah, so Caesar just thanked me for the work I did.
But he still didn't want to give you an interview. Why is that?
No, I didn't ask for an interview.
Oh, I see. Okay.
I didn't. I'm in a restaurant. He's in the Philippines. I'm on the phone to, and I didn't ask for an interview because no, I mean, that's that side of the story, really, Dan's story. I really, in the sequel, I don't get into much about St. Eugene Caesar because I want Dan to I think an excellent book for Dan actually would be The Innocent Man. Would be better than
that would be an interesting book.
John Grisham's title, actually, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Really, for Dan's book, he was an innocent man. So, when it comes to that, then, see, there's so many things we can get into here.
Well, I understand that when Caesar first talked to Dan Muldaur, in the 80s, he was very hesitant, of course, to speak to any journalist. And he'd been falsely accused of this murder for so long. And he told Dan Muldaur, I believe at their first meeting, if you lie about me, if you slander me, I'm going to sue you. And I think he told that to every journalist who ever tried to talk to him. And I would assume that he told Robert Kennedy Jr. the same thing when these negotiations were going on with Dan as the middleman and if you lie about me, I'm going to sue you. And then on the day that he died, Robert Kennedy Jr. put out a post on Instagram with Caesar's picture saying, "This is the man who killed my father."
Yes.
And he waited until he was dead because you can't slander the dead, right?
Exactly.
He couldn't get sued.
Probably, actually, but there you go. Look, I know the full story about the Robert Kennedy St. Eugene Caesar, but I don't want to tell it because Dan Muldaur's the guy to tell it. You can read some of it on muldaur.com if your viewers are interested, if your listeners, viewers are interested. Go to muldaur.com. It was Dan Muldaur who solved this case, absolutely. Every piece of it, including the bullets in the door, the alleged bullets in the door jams. There were lots of holes in the door jams. He interviewed all of the detectives involved. He understood how some detectives were making comments when they weren't ballistics experts. I think it was, yes, it was an FBI agent who first pointed this out to Dan and said, these people wouldn't know a bullet hole from any other hole because. So I'll leave it up to Dan to tell that story because Robert Kennedy did get it wrong. Look, if it hadn't been for Robert Kennedy's position on his father's murder, I suppose I would have supported Robert Kennedy. He's a very bright guy, and that's what's surprising as well. He's a very intelligent, bright guy. I read his book Frame when he was fighting his cousin's side, who was accused.
The one about Michael Skakel and the Martha Moxley murder. Yeah.
And, you know, I read that book. I thought it was excellent. You know, I mean, he did a marvelous job. He's taken, you know, he's done a lot for the environment. I think he's a very honest politician. Honest in the sense that, you know, you can be honest and get some things wrong. And so there was some division.
Yeah, I agree with
But
you.
in
I think he
terms of
just got
his-
it wrong, and I think that he was misled by a researcher who was not honest, and that person is Lisa Pease.
I don't want to talk about her because I don't want to slander. I don't do. We know it's in. Look, if I get started about, I was on one program. It was an Arab program, Dubai, I think, and they asked for an interview. So, you know, it was like a split screen, like it is now. She was on one side, and I was on. Actually, I couldn't see it, but then she started coming out. I just thought, my God, I can't allow. She's coming out with whoppers, and really, she believes 9/11 was a false flag operation. She's the Alex Jones of the Robert Kennedy case. And Alex Jones, oh my God. Alex Jones and Roger Stone, can you imagine?
Right.
They made millions out of their stories and false flag. But, you know, we're laughing, but at the same time, with, you know, the likes of Alex Jones, that was serious, as you know. I mean, there was four kids. You know, Sandy Hook, and their parents.
Well, and Alex Jones has just lost his entire broadcast empire. The Sandy Hook families are taking his property.
Yeah, QAnon type idiots, and that's what the RFK case is turning into. QAnon type people who are just inventing things. I mean, you know, there's well, he didn't fire bullets at all, really? No, there were blanks. Okay, then prove it. Well, they can't. They can't prove a lot of things that they make up. They make stuff up, and that's the difference between the people you can respect who write books and the people you can't.
Well, yeah, I should explain to the viewers who might not have read Lisa's book. She has a theory, which has always sounded pretty wacky to me, that Sirhan wasn't firing bullets, he was firing blanks. It's just wow.
I know where she got it from as well. It was a statement made, you know, by one of the pantry witnesses. And it looked like, you know, when people try to describe something, which they find hard to describe, well, it looked like I saw pieces of paper just in the chaos. It was mayhem. And yes, that's exactly what happened. Mayhem in chaos in a small confined space. You're going to find state. I'll give you an example, Laurie. After the assassination, there was that many actors in there. You've got to think hard. Which one am I thinking of now? There's that many people involved. So at the Ambassador Hotel, after the shooting, there was a guy running around with an American flag in his mouth saying, you know, sort of bad things about Bobby Kennedy. And in that area, there were people who were like supporting McCarthy, for example, McCarthy supporters. There was a woman with a polka dot dress, actually, that said McCarthy, supporting McCarthy. So there were many people who did make anti-Kennedy statements that night in the Ambassador Hotel. These were people who, of course, he had his haters. So there's another example in chaos. You get Michael Wayne, another actor who actually looked like Sirhan. He got an autograph. He got Kennedy to autograph on the way to the ballroom. He got Kennedy to autograph a poster, I think. And there you go, Michael Wayne. Running out of the hotel with a rifle in a wrapped up poster. Look, this is what happens in the midst of mayhem. You get people saying things like this. That story is covered in the Forgotten Terrorist, of course, Michael Lane. Totally innocent guy. But, you know, once you whack one down, one conspiracy story down, they'll just think of another one. It happens all the time.
And I guess the most persistent conspiracy theory that I'd like to address that has been there since the early 70s when Paul Schrade and Allard Lowenstein teamed up and sued the LAPD. Of course, their question was about ballistics and making the ballistics match the autopsy report. Of course, Thomas Noguchi estimated that the shot was fired from a very close distance, an inch and a half from the senator's ear. And, you know, there were all these witnesses who say, Sirhan was standing 3 feet in front of Kennedy and that shot was physically impossible to make. And I wanted to really dig into that with you here because that seems to be what this case really hinges on in terms of ballistics and convincing people who believe there was a second shooter that it was impossible for Sirhan to make that shot. Tell me how Sirhan could have made that shot and did make that shot.
First off, Noguchi didn't say 1.5 inches exactly. He said 1 to 3. Tattooing on the ear, tattooing is where, you know, the carbon residue from the gun. It was on the jacket as well. So Sirhan definitely got his pistol. Vincent DiPiero, whose father was, I think his father was the Navy D or something, is one of the best witnesses. You know, they say no one saw Sirhan with his gun close to Kennedy, 6 feet away. Some said 12. You know, remember, he started to fire. Everybody's turning this way and that. At the time Sirhan started firing, Kennedy came behind the platform of the ballroom, turned right, walked along a passage, through the pantry doors. When he came through the pantry doors, there were the kitchen workers lined up. They wanted to shake hands with him. Juan Romero was with Juan Romero.
The busboy.
So he was walking this way. The serving tables were on the left. So he was walking this way and he turned to his left. When he turned to his left, he shook hands. His head, the rear of his head, was exposed to Sirhan, who was in front of Carl Euclid. By the way, Carl Euclid never saw the shooting at all. Although he used to prop up the idea that Sirhan never got near. As Vincent DiPiero said, when he watched everything, he actually counted the shots, 8 shots. He's a very good witness. Vincent DiPiero said, yes, of course, he was like 3 feet away, but you just outstretch your arm and see what happened. With an added length, which is the gun. So you just do that. You stick out your arm. What happened?
You mean
was
like this?
Shot,
I mean,
like
my
this.
camera is literally like 2.5 feet away from me right now, and that's.
By the way,
that's how
Laurie, you
close
should
I
never
am.
point a gun at anyone. So,
very poor form of me. Sorry about that. Just a finger.
You've got to NRA rules. So when he was the first shot, and then clearly Bobby Kennedy was like this. My God, shot. And then when he was hit, he was falling. That's where you get the angle of the shots, by the way. Yeah, he's falling. He's going down. Frank Burns, one of the witnesses, said he saw the gun, the arc of the gun following Kennedy as Kennedy was going down. So, yes, the right rear of his head was exposed. Absolutely simple.
To me,
And
that
whose gun?
actually does make
Whose
sense. That
gun is
does make
here?
sense.
Sirhan's gun. Was Thane Eugene Caesar's gun? No, not Thane Eugene Caesar. Don't know him. This is the point. Not one witness. Plenty of witnesses with a gun in his hand. Anyone see Thane Eugene Caesar? No, of course. And I mean, the whole idea is that the other point about Thane Eugene Caesar is that.
Let me interrupt you real quick. Mel, if you wouldn't mind coming a little bit closer to your computer. You're breaking up a little bit, and I noticed that when you sit closer to the computer, we can hear you better, and it seems to be a better signal. So start over with what you were just saying there about that.
Thane Eugene Caesar. Another point about Thane Eugene Caesar. In this, it gets to the heart of why conspiracies, why people are believing some conspiracy nonsense. Let's say, for the sake of argument, Thane Eugene Caesar not only had his .38 caliber pistol, but also had the 22 concealed, his H&R 22. So then he's the killer. He gets away with it. Why does he keep the gun for 3 months? He didn't sell it till September of that year. Why did he keep the what type of murderer? Brainless murderer, brainless hitman would keep a gun for 3 months. That's ridiculous. Well, he could have just thrown it in the river. So it's lack of the use of logic and reasoning, which is just shocking with a lot of these writers.
I'd also like to ask you, what are your pet peeves? Because I know that you have to deal with dispelling these conspiracy theories all the time. What is your main pet peeve on this case? What just drives you crazy?
Well, that's one of them I just mentioned.
Right?
Did
I miss any?
Logic. You wouldn't keep you wouldn't keep a gun that you used to murder somebody. Well, I really don't get upset with them anymore because I really think that despite what Robert Kennedy Jr. has said, I think that there are more and more people now outside the QAnon type bunch you've got in America, all right? Outside that type of person, there are more and more people coming around to be rational about this subject. There is no evidence of conspiracy. There are lots of tales, made-up tales of conspiracy, but no evidence. As the court said in 2017, Beverly Reed O'Connell, making the last statement about Sirhan's appeals for the new trial or freedom. She used Judge Andrew Wistridge as sort of examination of all the evidence. Dan Mulday and I helped out too with that because we helped the Deputy Attorney General, California Attorney General.
That was Kamala Harris. Wasn't that Kamala Harris?
I didn't deal with Kamala Harris. Dan and I dealt with Jamie Fuster.
I see.
But we didn't have any. She wrote the final.
She wrote the opinion, though, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, she didn't write the opinion. She was like not the judge. She wasn't a judge's opinion. She wrote the brief.
I see.
Or I think it was Jamie Fuster who wrote it actually. But there you go. So anyway, what Andrew Wistridge, he went through all of the case, and she presented that, and then by 2017, the whole case was over, right? And she called it the last act of an American tragedy. I forgot the words for that. Right? Meaning, look, this case has been examined endlessly. Um, I'm not afraid of another investigation like Bobby Kennedy Jr. wants at all. If they want to spend, if the California government wants to spend their money on that, well, go ahead. I'm confident that they won't find a smoking gun because there isn't a smoking gun. Then they won't
Let me ask
find
you
any.
this. Do you think that if they reopen the case now and tried to do another investigation, do you think that after 56 years that the case is just too cold, that most of the witnesses are dead, the a lot of the evidence was destroyed back in the 70s? Do you really think that it would go anywhere?
If people want to try that, if that's the decision that people made, I have no fear of that at all. Go ahead. It's just, I think it'd be wasting money. There you go. But if that's their decision, that's fine with me.
Do you think that there's anything new that can be discovered through advances in forensic technology or DNA?
Not at all.
Or,
my new book, The Making of an Assassin, all about Sirhan's time, from the time he committed the crime to his time in prison and his parole appeals. It shows Sirhan. It shows his journey, taking the two-track approach. Two-track approach. Oh, he's got all of these people, dupes who were working for him. They call the conspiracies. And he takes the approach that if you're going to get parole, you can't be coming out with nonsense like that. You've got to show some contrition, some remorse. And he's been doing that. And he's allowing his supporters to do all of this fantasizing about, he was just the second gun, but it was somebody else who killed Kennedy.
A patsy. Just a patsy.
Yeah. Just like a patsy. Just like a. Oh, by the way, just like a patsy, Sirhan followed Oswald's story. Yeah,
I'm sure he did. I didn't know that, but it makes sense.
You know why I think he used John Doe as the name John Doe and all of that? He was wrapped up in the excitement of the moment that he was doing what Oswald did. He was the second Kennedy assassin.
Right. To me, that points to premeditation. When he went in to do the shooting, he left his ID in the glove compartment of the car, which tends to point to premeditation. If you're going to go do something, you don't want to have your ID on you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Good point. There were lots of other things that, getting back to, the new book, which will be out later this year or early next year. That just, that takes the stuff, that gets the reader to understand, the people who've read The Forgotten Terrorist, good. I hope you enjoyed it, but this will take them further and digging deep into who Sirhan really was. And I think it'll reveal a lot that previously, people hadn't understood. So good work. But they've got to read Dan Muldaur's book as well, by the way, because that's the one that is the definitive work on what exactly happened.
Do you think that Sirhan Sirhan is mentally ill, or do you think that he knew exactly what he was doing when he shot Robert Kennedy?
Anybody who commits murder has to have something mentally wrong about them. Really, I mean, that's the first point. He enjoyed fooling the psychiatrist. And I've got him on record making that statement. He really did. He lied continuously during his time in prison. There's so much, that we can talk about. But look, people have to read the book. Okay.
Well, he's changed his story numerous times through the years.
Yeah, people don't understand that. I'll give you one example. There's a newspaper in Britain called the Daily Mirror. So this reporter from the Daily Mirror, back in 1978, I'm not sure, like a 10-year anniversary story. He went to, I think it was San Quentin at the time, whatever, Corcoran perhaps. But he went into Sirhan's cell, and Sirhan then revealed all he knew, all he knew, all he did exactly on the night of the assassination. He also added, as he usually does, I really don't know. He was caught out many times. An example where the two kitchen workers, earlier that night, on the night of the assassination, he stopped these two kitchen workers more than once. Is Kennedy coming this way? Through the pantry. Is Kennedy coming this way? They gave testimony at the trial. During that time, Sirhan was sitting at the defense table with his lawyers, and his investigator, who was called Michael McCown. So he said, they are lying. How do you know you're lying? Because you said you couldn't remember. Oh, he gulped. The description was he gulped and then looked a bit sheepish. So, there were lots of tales like that. All kinds of. Oh, another one. They were talking about the Martin Luther King assassination and the JFK assassination, and Sirhan said words to the effect. Well, at least Kennedy saw me because they knew Martin Luther King was shot from a distance. Lee Harvey Oswald, JFK shot from a distance. And they said, oh, well, at least Kennedy saw me. And then, I think it was the author, an author said, really? I thought you said he couldn't remember. But, So it was slips like that, galore. Mm-hmm. He was lying.
Well, there's a stigma associated with mental illness in Arab culture, and several times during his trial, Sirhan objected to the defense tactic that his defense team was using, this diminished capacity, temporary insanity kind of thing. Right. He said, I'm not crazy. There was, I think, a very dramatic moment in the courtroom in February of 1969 where Sirhan basically went straight to the judge and said, Judge, my lawyers are lying. I want to fire my defense team. I'm not crazy. I killed Robert Kennedy with 20 years of malice aforethought. I knew exactly what I was doing. And he wanted to change his plea to guilty.
Some of the conspiracy theorists, by the way, used to ridicule that statement, 20 years malice aforethought. They couldn't understand, the type of language people he was using as a symbolism, because they were laughing, saying he was 4 years older.
Right.
Yeah. 48.
Because he was referring to the 1948 war, the Nakba.
Yeah, that's what he was doing. In other words, since a child, he'd had this malice about the Israelis.
Right.
So, yeah, you're right.
Did you ever get to interview Sirhan yourself?
No. I did ask. In fact, during the writing of this book, I sent a recorded letter to his present, Robert J. Donovan prison, California. Recorded letter. So I know he got it. Given him the chance to comment, which I will include in the book, anything he wanted to say, but he can actually say the liars or whatever. I said, whatever you write, I'll make sure that's used. But no reply.
Interesting. From what I understand, and this is the way it's been since his trial, I don't think any journalist or author gets to talk to Sirhan without going through his defense team, and they only seem to approve interviews with friendly journalists. And in fact, when Dan Moldea got to interview Sirhan back in the 90s, I think the only way he managed to get in there was at the time he thought that Sirhan might be innocent, and so they let him talk to Sirhan, which was probably a mistake because then Sirhan contradicted himself and lied to Dan Moldea.
Yeah. He was with Adele at the time. I mean, all the brothers are dead now, apart from Munir, who was the youngest. But he was Dan was with Adele Sirhan at that end. Look, your viewers, your listeners and viewers, have to read Dan's book, The Killing of Robert Kennedy. That'll explain such an awful lot of things. Look, as I said before, Dan solved this case, no doubt.
I agree, because Dan's a great true crime reporter, and he really, understands and dug down deep into the ballistics evidence of the case. But what I think your unique contribution to the scholarship of the Robert Kennedy assassination is no other author, even Dan, really kind of overlooked this largely in his work, was the biography of Sirhan, the pathology of Sirhan, the Arab nationalism of Sirhan, which is what the crime is all about. It's about the motive. And I haven't seen anyone else really take the time to dig deep into this like you have. And I think we should talk a little bit before we go about the current situation with the war in Gaza, the rising anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment throughout the world, especially with young people. And at this time, we see Robert Kennedy's son, RFK Jr., out there on the campaign trail without Secret Service protection, just like his father. And I personally am very worried for his safety in this heightened risk environment. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what's going on the college campuses, this, the rise of the pro-Gaza movement and the encampments, rather pro-Hamas encampments, and your thoughts on Robert Kennedy being out there without any Secret Service protection.
Well, I wrote a book called Protecting the Presidential Candidates. Now, I looked
Yes, you
into
did.
Candidates from, presidents, well, candidates and presidents from 1960 up to the time of Joe Biden. And, I delved into, I couldn't use all of the presidential candidates. You'd be talking about hundreds of people there. Some were candidates for only 2 weeks, as you know. So, but I looked at the front runners and their protection too. And, that just explains how a lot of people, I think a lot of Americans don't understand how dangerous it has been for candidates in the past, and more so now, because they are bringing their anger and hatred. It's been shipped to America, just like Vietnam was shipped to America, as it were, all those years ago, all those decades ago. And when you have anger like that, it's candidates sometimes are frightened to speak out. That's
true.
harms democracy when you have that danger. But this touches on Sirhan's life too, because the core of Sirhan has got a lot to do with the time with his education, the time he was taught in schools. I mean, look, it's still happening in schools in the West Bank where you're teaching hatred. Jews are less than human. Jews, it's your duty to kill a Jew. This is still happening. Right. The UN was supposed to investigate this some years ago. They said they had, but recent report last year, it's still going on. And they, now how any Western student can actually not see this? These are supposed to be intelligent young people in universities today, and they are accepting, this support for Hamas. Hamas is the worst of the worst. I mean, the actual Palestinian, the West Bank is different from Gaza, in that Hamas is ruled by, Gaza is ruled by Hamas, and the West Bank is ruled by the Palestinian Authority, the PA. Mm-hmm. Even the PA, which is more liberal in their attitude
moderate.
towards
moderate,
teaching.
I guess.
Well, I won't use that term. But
I wouldn't call it moderate, but I guess compared to Hamas.
and the West Bank schools, even they are still using this curriculum, which is brainwashing, basically. So that's what Sirhan went through with his teaching.
Yes.
And it's a teaching of hatred. It's a teaching that you cannot come to terms with the Jews because they are beasts. They use language like that, as you know, Laurie.
Yes.
Language like that, it's incredible. So that's one of the reasons. The brainwashing of hatred is what spurred Sirhan.
Do you think that Robert Kennedy Jr. is in danger on the campaign trail?
It's hard to tell about which candidate is in danger. Really, all of them are.
All of them.
But Robert Kennedy especially, because there may be somebody who's like mentally deranged. It would have to be somebody who's mentally deranged who thinks that he might do the. Oh, I was going to get into the copycat effect earlier, but we didn't go far with that one because the copycat effect is very powerful, and you see it with any major crimes. You'll get repeated by someone who's like deranged.
Well, and we see that just in the past. I was just going to add, in the past few months, you talk about copycats. I was just going to add, we were talking about copycats, and in the last few months, we've seen, people setting themselves on fire, self-immolating in solidarity with the Gazan plight. Like you've got Aaron Bushnell, and there was a lady in Atlanta, and sadly, I'm afraid that's becoming a thing. There are these acts of political sacrifice or violence in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, and that's one of the reasons that I am concerned about Robert Kennedy's safety, particularly because he's the son of Robert Kennedy.
Yes.
But I think that any politician right now that stands with Israel is at risk. Don't you?
I do. And you are correct. When you ask me which, all candidates are in danger, right? All people running for the president. But yes, I think, Robert Kennedy Jr. has got that added danger attached to it because of this copycat effect. Oh, look, I'm going to be the third Kennedy assassin. Yeah, really, it's possible. I wouldn't dismiss it at all. In fact, I'd be like you, I would be concerned about it. And I think really, the getting getting protection when you're running for president, it's a kind of complicated issue. You've got to, be susceptible to polling and the primaries and all of this, and you've got the political leaders in Congress involved as well as the president. But the president can actually do themselves. This is what happened with President Obama, who got a protection. I think it was at least a year.
Oh, at
before
least.
the election.
Yeah.
Why? Because, well, given the circumstances, the first black president, yes, of course, it's logical to assume that he'd be under more danger than others. So, yes, Biden could do this. I hope he does.
I do too. I don't know what's taken him so long. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Well into the election now, yeah. I mean, the conventions, what's this, June? Yeah, convention
starts next month.
Early August.
Right. It just doesn't make any sense. I hate to assume the worst about President Biden, but it seems to me, I mean, he says that Robert Kennedy was his hero. He's got a bust of Robert Kennedy sitting behind him in the Oval Office on the desk.
Right.
He's close to Ethel. He's close to a lot of Bobby's siblings. And yet, even though Bobby Kennedy is challenging him for the presidency, it's just the right thing to do. And they've known each other for 40 years, always had a friendly relationship until now. Something just seems off. It seems completely wrong to me, especially under the circumstances with a war in the Middle East. President Biden is old enough to know better. He remembers 1968. He understands very well the reasons why Robert Kennedy was killed, and it's just horrible that he continues to deny Secret Service protection.
Yeah, look, apart from the issues we've talked about, it's very possible Bobby Kennedy Jr. could make a good president. Very possible.
Well, I know we're just about out of time, and I've enjoyed this so much. 2 hours, and we barely scratched the surface. So I hope that we can do this again when your new book on Sirhan comes out, because I want to dive deep into that. When is that new book coming out, Mel?
Nothing's decided. In fact, we haven't gone through the editing process yet. So there's no date for certain. It'll be late this year or early next year, from now till next spring, perhaps. So we'll see. In the meantime, I'll keep listening to your broadcasts and see if I can learn more.
Well, I've learned so much from you, and I want to thank
you. I'm a fan
you.
of you now, actually. Look, your interview with Craig Colgan in the last couple of days, great writing, Craig. And
I love Craig Colgan.
And look, I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that I can persuade Dan to join you, because, look,
that would be great.
He's the real expert. I'm telling you.
I've talked to, I think, every major author who's written about the RFK case except Dan. So I hope that I can get Dan Muldia on the show as well, so that I can say that I've talked to everybody and learned all that I can and present all that I can to the audience. A lot of the people who follow my podcast, because I'm a volunteer on the Kennedy campaign, we have a lot of Robert Kennedy Jr. followers out there, young people who aren't old enough to remember 1968, aren't old enough to remember the golden age of Palestinian hijackings and terrorism in the 70s and 80s and the things that our generation grew up with. This younger generation has a lot to learn, and that's kind of the aim of this series. Is I'm trying to show the younger generation things that we grew up with that they are lucky to have no concept of. They're lucky to grow up in an era, in a post 9/11 age, when they can get on a flight and be safe. And, hijackings, thank goodness, are a thing of the past. But Palestinian terror is not a thing of the past, as we were reminded on October the 7th and continue to be reminded. It's still a very real threat in our world. And to them, Sirhan Sirhan is a hero for what he did. And I believe that Sirhan, as you say, was like the first shot in the war on terror. He really started the ball rolling.
No one realized that. And no one has realized it until, flaky. But it was. Well, obviously, 9/11 made a lot of people think, made a lot of people look at the subject. But connecting it with the Kennedy assassination, people started to do that. Yeah.
Yes.
But Robert Kennedy, before we go, pass on my wishes to Robert Kennedy. He's.
I shall.
I'm not an anti-Robert Kennedy person. I just wish that he'd really look at this case the way that I see it. But look, it's everybody's choice to choose which direction they go in, and accepting, explanations. So there you
and
go.
you know what's ironic, Mel?
I can't vote for him though, because I'm not American.
That's true. You know what the irony is, though, Mel? For most of Bobby's life, he agreed with you. He agreed with the rest of his family. He thought Sirhan was guilty. And then he fell under the influence of Paul Schrade and Lisa Pease, and they changed his mind. Yeah. So the nice thing about Bobby, though, is he is always willing to change his mind when he's presented with better evidence. So he could always change his mind back to where he started in the first place.
I always remember, he was in the Ambassador Hotel, the night of the shooting upstairs.
That was David. That was his brother David. Bobby was back home, back east.
Oh, I see. Right, I'm getting mixed up with David, which was
poor David. He was
tragic story in itself, of course. With David.
That's right. He died of a drug overdose.
Yeah.
It had such an impact on the family.
He saw on TV, I think, with his babysitter, didn't he?
Yes,
upstairs
that's right.
In the room. Yes, I was getting him mixed up with Bobby there.
Yeah, it's hard to keep those Kennedys straight. There's a lot of them.
What Kennedy said, walk in their shoes. What they had to go through. Really.
Just imagine.
So anyway, I wish that American students would just look at try and read some good literature, really sort of a balanced account at least.
And they should start with your book, all of your books, but especially the one about
I'm
RFK.
talking about the situation as a whole. They could buy that one, for example. And why? Because it's Doug Waxman is like a well-respected person who looks at all sides and talks honestly. Really, that's what students should do. But
I agree, and I want to thank you. I'm sorry that we're running out of time. I just got about 20 seconds left before the recording cuts off, so I just wanted to thank you one more time to Mel Ayton. Thank you. I hope you will join us again here on Strange Bedfellows, and we will see you guys back here next Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern. Until then, peace.
In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.